The snow had been falling for 3 hours before Lydia Callahan pulled on her dead husband's coat and walked out into the white fury of it, alone, because that was simply what a person did when 14 head of cattle had gone missing and nobody else was left to go after them. The year was 1878, and the Wyoming Territory was not a place that forgave the unprepared. Lydia had learned that lesson the hard way 18 months ago, standing beside a fresh mound of frozen earth with a 6-year-old daughter clutching her skirts and a ranch that owed more than it owned. Thomas Callahan had been a good man in the way that many good men of that era were good, hardworking, honest, occasionally reckless, and it had been that final quality, that recklessness, that had put him in the path of a horse spooked by a rattlesnake on a summer afternoon that should have been ordinary. Lydia had not sold the ranch. Everyone had told her to. Her brother-in-law had ridden out from Cheyenne specifically to deliver the advice in person, his hat in his hands, his expression carrying the particular mixture of pity and condescension that she had come to recognize as the default expression of men who believed a woman alone on 40 acres in Wyoming was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. She had fed him dinner, listened politely, and sent him back to Cheyenne the following morning with a jar of her preserved peaches and a very firm no. That had been 17 months ago. The ranch was still hers. The cattle, or rather, the 14 that had escaped through a section of fence she now realized had been weakened by the weight of ice accumulating on the top rail since Wednesday, were somewhere out in the storm, and Lydia intended to find them. She had left her daughter, Clara, at the Hendersons' place 2 miles east, which was where Clara spent most school days anyway, boarding during the heavy weeks of winter when the roads between their ranch and the small town of Harlow Flats became unreliable. Mrs. Henderson was a practical woman who understood that Lydia Callahan's child was better served by warmth and company during storms than by the cold mathematics of necessity, and she had never once asked for more than a neighborly kindness in return. So Clara was safe. Lydia checked the rope she had coiled over her left shoulder, pulled the scarf higher over her nose, and stepped past the broken fence into the field beyond. The snow was already mid-calf and falling faster than it had been an hour ago. The sky had that particular gray-white quality that old-timers in Harlow Flats called a burial sky, which was not an expression Lydia particularly appreciated, though she understood the accuracy of it. There was no horizon visible. The ground and the air had become one continuous pale erasure, and the only thing marking direction was the slight upward slope of the land toward the northern ridge where she had, through long familiarity with her own property, come to understand the cattle often drifted when they were frightened. They had drifted before. They always drifted north. She had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes, head down against the wind, when she heard something she had not expected. A voice. Not shouting, not panicked, just a calm, carrying voice speaking to something unseen. The kind of tone a person uses when they are trying to keep a spooked animal from bolting, low and deliberate and steady. And beneath it, the unmistakable sound of cattle moving, the particular combination of hooves in snow and the wet, complaining sound cattle make when they are being herded somewhere they are not entirely sure they want to go. Lydia stopped walking. She squinted through the curtain of snow and made out, gradually, the shape of a horse and rider moving slowly along the northern edge of her property, and beside the rider, pressed together in a loose group and moving with reluctant cooperation, were her cattle, all 14 of them. The rider was a man she did not immediately recognize, which was unusual in itself because Harlow Flats was not a large community and she knew most faces within 20 miles. He was big through the shoulders, sitting a dark horse she had never seen, wearing a canvas coat that was already crusted white along the left side from the driving wind. He had not seen her yet. He was focused entirely on the cattle, keeping them together with small, precise movements of the horse that spoke to years of practice. Lydia walked forward. The man turned at the sound of her boots in the snow, and even at 20 yards through the storm she could see the moment he registered her presence, the slight shift of his posture from working concentration to something else, something that might have been recognition, though she was quite sure she had never met him. He said, "I figured you would come." She stopped walking again. He said it without arrogance, without the kind of self-satisfied satisfaction that would have immediately put her back up. He said it the way a person states something they had simply calculated, the way you might say the sun came up this morning, as though the appearance of Lydia Callahan in a blizzard after her cattle was so completely in keeping with what he had already worked out about the situation that he was not surprised by it at all. She said, "Whose cattle did you think they were?" He said, "Yours. Callahan brand. I know this stretch of fence. I knew when I found them pushed up against the ridge that whoever was going to come after them was going to come alone and on foot, because the Callahan place doesn't run more than one hand at this time of year, and the hand is a woman who doesn't wait for better weather." Lydia stared at him for a moment. The snow was collecting on the brim of her hat and sliding off in small avalanches. One of the cattle, old number 7, a brown and white heifer with an expression of permanent mild grievance, chose this moment to attempt a sideways departure, and the man's horse cut her off with practiced ease without any visible direction from its rider. Lydia said, "Who are you?" He said, "Cyrus Covington. I've been wintering at the Alderman Spread 5 miles north. I was out checking their fence line when I found yours broken and these animals heading for the ridge. If they'd gotten up into that timber in this storm, you wouldn't have seen them until spring." He said this last part without drama, which she appreciated because it was simply true. She said, "I'm Lydia Callahan." He said, "I know." She decided she was going to ask him about that later. For now, there were 14 cattle that needed to be walked back to the barn, a fence section that needed temporary repair before morning, and a storm that was showing absolutely no interest in cooperating with any of this. She went to work. What she noticed about Cyrus Covington over the next hour and a half, as they moved the cattle back south across her property and into the barn, was that he worked the way very few people worked, without wasted motion, without needing to be told anything twice, without filling the silence with unnecessary talk. He was not silent in the way that some men were silent, that particular closed silence that felt like a wall. His silence felt more like attention, like he was doing the courtesy of paying close notice to everything happening around him and not cluttering it up with commentary. When they had the cattle secured and the barn door latched against the wind, Lydia straightened up and looked at the broken fence section they had propped temporarily with a cedar post she kept in the barn for emergencies. It would hold through the night if the wind didn't push it, and by morning she could assess the real damage. She turned to Cyrus Covington, who was standing in the relative shelter of the barn doorway, brushing snow from his coat with a gloved hand, and said, "You ought to come inside." He looked at the sky, which had, if anything, gotten worse in the last 20 minutes. The light was failing toward the early dark of a Wyoming winter afternoon, and the temperature had dropped another several degrees since she had left the house. He said, "My horse needs seeing to," she said. "There's room in the barn." He looked at her for a moment with dark eyes that were, she noticed, paying that same quality of close attention to her that he had been giving to the landscape and the cattle, and then he nodded once and went to unsaddle his horse. The horse was a black gelding he called Prentice, and Lydia watched him care for the animal with the same efficient tenderness she had observed in everything else he did. The way he checked each hoof, the way he spoke quietly to the horse while rubbing it down, and she found herself cataloging these details the way she had not cataloged details about any person, man or woman, in a very long time. She went to the house and built up the fire. By the time Cyrus knocked on the door and she called him in, the kitchen was warm enough that stepping inside from the cold was something close to physical relief, and she could see it in the brief change in his expression as the heat reached him, that involuntary softening that happens when a cold body finds warmth. He stood inside the door and removed his hat, and she got her first proper look at him in decent light. He was perhaps 32 or 33, She estimated with the kind of face that outdoor work in difficult country produced, weathered without being rough, with strong lines around the eyes from squinting against sun and snow, and a jaw that carried a few days of dark stubble. He was not pretty the way Thomas had been pretty, with that easy Irish handsomeness that had made half the women in Harlow Flats sigh. Cyrus Covington's face had more weight to it, more history. She said, "Sit down. There's coffee." He said, "Thank you." She poured the coffee and set a plate of cornbread on the table and sat down across from him, because it was her house and her table, and she had long ago decided that she was not going to stand in her own kitchen while a guest sat. She said, "You said you knew this was the Callahan place, and you said you knew I didn't have help." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and looked at her steadily. He said, "I've passed through Harlow Flats twice in the last year. Small towns talk. I heard about Thomas Callahan's accident. I heard his wife kept the ranch." He paused. "People in town seem to think that's remarkable," she said. "People in town seem to think a great many things." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but something in the neighborhood of one. He said, "I gathered," she said. "What brings you to this part of Wyoming, Mr. Covington? You don't sound like a Wyoming man." He said, "Missouri originally. I've been working cattle in various territories for the last 8 years. I came north from Colorado in September. The aldermans needed winter help, and I needed somewhere to put my boots for a few months," she said. "And in the spring." He said, "I haven't decided." There was something in the way he said it that made her think the uncertainty was newer than the sentence suggested, as though the decision about spring was something he had been examining quite recently and finding more complicated than it had seemed before. She did not ask about that. Instead, she said, "Well, Mr. Covington, it appears this storm isn't letting up before morning. You're welcome to the spare room. I won't have it said that I sent a man who gathered my cattle back into a blizzard for want of a bed." He looked at her for a moment and then said, "I appreciate it." She said, "The spare room has 2 quilts and there's a washstand with water that won't be frozen yet if you want it." He said, "Mrs. Callahan." She said, "Yes." He said, "I want you to know I'm not a man who causes trouble." She said, "Mr. Covington, if you were a man who caused trouble, you would not be sitting at my table." That got a real smile out of him. It changed his face considerably. She noticed that too. The snow fell all through the night. Lydia lay in the darkness of her bedroom listening to it hit the window glass, which it did with a sound like whispered secrets, persistent and accumulating. And she thought about the 14 cattle in the barn and the broken fence, and the spring repairs she was going to need to budget for. And she also, unavoidably, thought about the man sleeping in the spare room at the end of the hall, who had been out there in the blizzard before she had arrived and who had said, with that calm certainty, that he had figured she would come. That sentence kept returning to her. Not because it was remarkable in its meaning. It wasn't. She had, in fact, come, but because of the quality of the knowing in it. The way he had already understood something about her before they had exchanged a single word. She was not accustomed to being understood before she had done the work of explaining herself, and she found it disorienting in a way she was not certain was entirely unpleasant. She fell asleep thinking about dark eyes paying attention. In the morning, the storm had dropped 8 inches on the ground and then blown itself out just before dawn, leaving the world in that crystalline, exhausted quiet that follows heavy Wyoming snow, where the light was so bright off the white surfaces that it was almost painful and the air felt newly made. Lydia was up at 5, as she always was, and had the stove going and water heating before she heard movement in the spare room. Cyrus Covington appeared in the kitchen doorway at 5:15, fully dressed, his dark hair still carrying the slight disorder of sleep, but his eyes fully alert in the way that spoke to a man who had spent years waking in the dark to work. She said, "Coffee's ready," he said. "I'll do the morning check on the cattle before I ride to the alderman's." She said, "I already have a list of what the fence section needs. There's a hardware supplier in Harlow Flats who carries wire. I was going to go tomorrow if the roads are passable." He poured himself coffee and stood by the window looking out at the new snow. He said, "The main road should be clear enough by tomorrow afternoon. The snow's dry. It'll compact." she said. That's my assessment as well. He turned from the window and looked at her with those attentive eyes. He said, Mrs. Callahan, I want to offer to help with the fence repair. I know you didn't ask. I'm offering anyway. The aldermans don't need me today, and the section your cattle broke out of won't hold through another hard storm on a cedar post alone. She looked at him. She said, Mr. Covington, I have been accepting help from precisely nobody for 17 months. I find it does not come naturally to me. He said, I noticed, she said. That was not a no. He nodded once as though this was sufficient. They spent the morning working the fence together, which meant 2 hours in the cold with wire stretchers and new staples from her supply box, working side by side without much conversation, but with a rhythm that she found unexpectedly comfortable, the kind of working partnership where both people read the task well enough that asking becomes mostly unnecessary. He was stronger than she was, which was simply a fact, and she acknowledged it without resentment. And she was more familiar with her own fence line's particular quirks. And between these two things, they had the broken section repaired by late morning to a standard that satisfied them both. When they came inside to warm up, he said, How long has the east corner been loose? She said, Since October. I have it on the list. He said, I can fix that too. She said, Mr. Covington. He said, Cyrus. She looked at him. She said, Cyrus, you don't owe me anything beyond what you did yesterday. He said, I know that. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her directly in that way he had, that way of not looking away from things. He said, I'm not doing it out of obligation. I'm doing it because it needs doing, and I'm here and I don't have anywhere I need to be. She said, after a moment, All right, but you'll take dinner for it. He said, That seems fair. He stayed 3 days. Not because the fence work demanded 3 days, though the east corner and 2 additional sections she had been putting off for lack of time did account for a full day and a half of work. He stayed 3 days because on the second evening the conversation over dinner moved from practical matters into something else entirely, the kind of conversation that starts with the land and the season and somehow arrives at the subjects people keep folded up inside them, the things they carry without often being able to set them down. She told him about Thomas. Not the mythology of Thomas that she sometimes performed for people who were waiting to receive it. The brave husband, the tragic accident, but the actual Thomas, the man she had loved and married at 23 in a ceremony in her mother's parlor in Nebraska, the man who had made her laugh harder than anyone she had ever known, and who had also, with the particular blindness of men who trusted their own luck, made decisions that terrified her regularly. She told him about the morning she had found the horse standing riderless at the fence line, and the way the world had divided into before, and after with a completeness she had not been prepared for. She told him about the 17 months of learning to carry weight she had not known she was capable of carrying. He listened the way he did everything, with complete attention and no interruption, and when she finished he said, You loved him a great deal. She said, Yes, I did, he said, and you've been furious at him for the last 17 months. She stared at him. He said quietly, That's not a criticism. It's just what I hear when you talk about him. Both things at once. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Yes. And then, because she had not said it to anyone before, she said, Both things at once. He nodded. She said, What about you, Cyrus Covington? Have you had both things at once with anyone? He was quiet for long enough that she thought perhaps she had overstepped, and then he said, I was engaged once, in Missouri, 7 years ago. She married someone else while I was working cattle in Kansas. He said it without self-pity. I don't carry it the way you're asking, but it's part of why I've been moving, she said, moving instead of stopping. He said, Yes, she said, and what would stopping look like? He looked at her across the table in the lamplight and said, I'm beginning to think I might recognize it when I see it. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was necessary, and then got up to clear the dishes, because she was a woman with good sense, and she knew that some things needed to be left on the table a while before they were picked up. He rode back to the alderman's spread on the 4th morning, with the sky clear and cold and blue overhead, and the snow blazing white in every direction. She stood in the yard and watched him go, the black horse moving easily through the compacted snow of the road, and she told herself that she was simply watching to see if the road conditions were as manageable as she had calculated, which was true, and also was not entirely the point. He turned once, at the bend where the road curved north, and touched the brim of his hat. She went inside and got on with her day. The following Saturday she went to Harlow Flats to collect Clara from the Hendersons, to do her supply run at Morrison's General Store, and to pick up wire from the hardware supplier, which was a man named Beaufort who had been supplying Harlow Flats with hardware goods since 1869, and who considered himself the primary repository of useful information in the territory, which was not entirely untrue. It was at Morrison's General Store, while she was comparing the prices on salt pork, that she heard his name. It was being spoken by Ed Alderman himself, a broad-faced rancher of 50-something who was talking to Jim Morrison over the counter with the unhurried ease of men who have known each other for 20 years. She was not eavesdropping. The store was small and she was standing 8 feet away. Ed Alderman was saying that Cyrus Covington was the best hand he had hired in a decade, that the man had an instinct for cattle, and for weather that was frankly remarkable, and that he had asked him to stay on through spring and into summer with a full hand's wages, and Covington had said he needed to think about it. Jim Morrison said, "What does a man like that need to think about?" Ed Alderman said, "Damned if I know. He went quiet on me when I asked." Lydia set down the salt pork and moved to the coffee section of the store, where she spent a substantial amount of time examining 2 identical bins of ground coffee, as though they presented an interesting intellectual puzzle. On the road home, with Clara in the wagon seat beside her talking about everything that had happened in the 10 days she had been at the Hendersons, Lydia thought about a man who had ridden away on a black horse and turned once at the bend in the road. Clara said, "Mama, who fixed the east fence?" Lydia said. "How did you know about the east fence?" Clara said, "Mrs. Henderson said you had a snowstorm while I was away and that you went out in it alone and somebody helped you with the cattle." Lydia said, "News travels fast in this territory." Clara said, "Who was it?" Lydia said, "A ranch hand named Covington from the Alderman spread." Clara, who was 7 years old and possessed of the uncanny perceptiveness that certain children develop when they have been paying close adult attention since very young, looked at her mother for a long moment and then said, with elaborate casualness, "Is he nice?" Lydia said, "He is." Clara nodded and returned to her account of what had happened at the Hendersons, but Lydia noticed that she was smiling slightly at the road ahead of them, and she decided not to comment on it. 2 weeks passed. Lydia repaired the barn roof where a section of shake had lifted during the storm, re-inventoried the root cellar, wrote 2 letters to her mother in Nebraska, who worried persistently and required regular reassurance, and spent considerable time doing the ranch accounting, which involved moving numbers around in a ledger until they added up to something that was manageable, if not comfortable. She did not think about Cyrus Covington. Or rather, she thought about him approximately as often as she thought about the east fence and the cattle that had nearly been lost in the storm, which is to say that certain days she barely thought about it at all, and other days she thought about almost nothing else. It was on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the blizzard, that she was working in the yard splitting wood, a task she had gotten genuinely competent at out of necessity, though Thomas had always claimed she held the axe wrong, when she heard a horse on the road and looked up to see a black gelding turning through her gate. She set the axe in the chopping block and stood up straight. Cyrus Covington rode into her yard on Prentice, and he looked just the same as he had when he had left, except that he had had a shave at some point since then, which she noticed and then immediately directed herself not to think about. He swung down from the saddle and said, "Good afternoon." She said, "Afternoon." He said, "I'm in Harlow Flats for supplies. I thought I'd stop." She said, "Harlow Flats is a mile south of my ranch." He said, "Yes, I know." She looked at him. He looked at her. The late afternoon sun was coming in at a low angle off the snow, and it lit up the yard with a quality of light that was, honestly, somewhat unfairly beautiful. She said, "I have coffee." He said, "I was hoping you might." This time when they sat at the table, there was less of the careful territory establishing of that first conversation and more of something else, a quality of ease that she recognized as the particular dividend of having already told the truth to someone, and found that they handled it well. They talked about the territory, and about the cattle market, and about a dispute that had been building between two large ranching families north of Harlow Flats over grazing rights on federal land, which was the kind of conflict that had a way of making everyone in a 50-mile radius very nervous, because those things had a history in Wyoming of not ending quietly. She told him about Clara, and he listened to the stories of her daughter with an attention that was not the performative interest men sometimes displayed, but something that felt like genuine curiosity, as though the particulars of a 7-year-old girl who had decided to name all 14 of the cattle and kept a running record of their individual personalities in a composition book were actually interesting. He said, "She sounds like her mother." She said, "In what way?" He said, "Pays close attention to things, keeps her own records." She said, "Clara is considerably more cheerful than I am." He said, "I don't know, I think you're pretty cheerful, you just don't perform it for people." She looked at him. He said, "I mean that as a compliment." She said, "I took it that way." He stayed for supper, which was a thing she had not planned on but which felt natural enough that she did not feel she had departed from any reasonable standard of behavior by offering it. Clara was home that evening, and she watched her daughter meet Cyrus Covington with the measuring look that children apply to new adults, evaluating them with a directness that most adults have learned to disguise. Within 20 minutes, Clara had explained to him the full organizational system of her cattle personality composition book, and he had listened to every word of it with visible interest, and had asked a follow-up question about whether number 7, the heifer with the grievance expression, had a different personality during different weather, which was apparently exactly the right question because Clara's face went bright and she said, "Yes, exactly. She is much worse when it rains." Lydia watched this from the stove and felt something move in her chest that she was not immediately ready to name. After supper, when Clara was in bed and the lamp was turned low, Lydia and Cyrus sat on the front porch in the cold, which was not entirely sensible, but the sky was extraordinary that night, a full dark dome of stars so bright and close they seemed pressurized, and she said, "Tell me something about Missouri." He said, "It's green, greener than anything you see out here. Sometimes I miss that particular color." She said, "What made you leave?" He said, "I told you, the woman." She said, "There's more to it than that. A woman leaving you doesn't make you a man who can't stop moving for 7 years. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "My father had a farm. After she married someone else, I couldn't see a way to stay and build something that didn't feel like a poor substitute for what I'd expected to build. So I left." He paused. "That was a cowardly way to put it. The truth is I ran." She said, "We all run from something." He said, "What did you run toward when you stayed, I mean, when everyone told you to sell?" She thought about it. She said, "Thomas and I built this place. It wasn't much when we started, but it was ours. And when he died, everything that was his became mine, and everything that was mine became more important to keep, because keeping it was the only argument I had against the idea that it all amounted to nothing." She stopped. "That probably sounds strange." He said, "No, it sounds like the most sensible thing I've ever heard." She looked at his profile in the starlight, the strong line of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders, and she thought about how long it had been since she had sat with someone on this porch and not felt profoundly alone while doing it. She said, "Cyrus." He turned to look at her. She said, "Ed Alderman asked you to stay on through summer." He said carefully, "He did." She said, "What did you tell him?" He said, "I told him I was thinking about it." She said, "And what are you thinking?" He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, I'm thinking that I've been in this territory for 4 months, and for the first 3 of them I had a very clear idea of where spring would take me, and in the last 3 weeks I've found that idea getting considerably less clear, she said, because of the fence repairs, he said, among other things. She turned back to the stars. She said, come back on Sunday. Clara wants to show you her composition book in full. He said, just Clara, she said, Sunday, Cyrus. He went home. But he was smiling when he rode away, and she allowed herself to notice that. Sunday came, and he came with it, and brought a small paper bag of peppermint candies from Morrison's General Store that Clara received with the reverence of someone being presented with something of genuine value. Lydia accepted the jar of good coffee he had also brought, which she recognized as a more complicated offering, practical and considerate, requiring someone to have paid attention to what she actually needed rather than what was merely pleasant, and put it on the shelf without making more of it than the occasion required. They spent Sunday afternoon the way she had begun to think of as their way of spending time, which was partly practical work. He looked at the barn roof she had repaired and made 2 suggestions that were plainly correct, and partly conversation that ranged from the immediate to the theoretical and back again, landing in unexpected places. He told her about the cattle drives he had ridden in the early 70s, the trail from Texas north through Kansas, the particular democracy of a trail crew, men from everywhere and every circumstance thrown together for months at a time with no option but to make it work, and how those months on the trail had taught him things about human beings that he could not have learned any other way. He told her about the free black cowboys he had ridden with, men of extraordinary competence and grit who were paid less and given less credit for the same work, and who nonetheless showed up every morning and did the job better than most, and he said it with a plainness that acknowledged the injustice without dressing it up as anything other than what it was. She said, my father believed in abolition. He was called difficult for it. He said, difficult people are often right. She said, is that what you think of me, difficult? He said, I think you are one of the most capable and clear-headed people I have ever met in my life, and I think that in a different world those qualities would not need to be described as difficult. But this is the world we have, she said. That's a very diplomatic answer, he said. It's an honest answer. She believed him. The weeks that followed had a quality she would later try to describe and find she could not do it without losing something in the translation. It was not courtship in the formal sense. There were no parlor calls arranged through intermediaries, no chaperone hovering in corners, no structured sequence of approved interactions. It was something more organic and more demanding than that, because they were 2 people who had already done their share of hard living and who did not have the patience or the inclination for performance. He came to her ranch on Sundays and sometimes on a Thursday if the alderman's work permitted. He worked when there was work to do, because he was constitutionally incapable of sitting idle when something needed doing, and she let him because she had observed enough to know that his help was offered without condition or expectation of return. He fixed the barn roof properly, which she had done adequately but not well, and she showed him the particular way her cattle needed to be handled during the spring calving period, which was coming, and which she had managed alone the year before and would have managed alone this year if things had gone differently, but which was considerably more manageable with 2 people who understood each other. Clara had decided to like him. She did not make this decision publicly or with any announcement, but Lydia watched it happen in the accumulation of small evidence. The way Clara began saving particular observations about the cattle specifically to share with him when he came, the way she showed him her drawings of the ranch as it had been before the big snow, the way she told him once, with that directness of children that Lydia still found slightly alarming, my mama sings when she thinks nobody is listening. Cyrus had looked at Lydia over Clara's head with an expression that she was certain was trying very hard not to be delighted. She had said, Clara. Clara had gone back to her composition book with the expression of someone who had said exactly what she meant to say. On an evening in late February, when the worst of the winter was beginning, just barely, to yield, the light staying a few minutes longer each day, the temperature grudgingly dropping a degree or two less at night. Cyrus stayed late enough that the moon was well up before he made any move toward the door. They had been talking about the territory, about the way the cattle business was changing, about the fence law debates that were brewing in the legislature, and what it would mean for small ranchers if the big outfits got their way. And then at some point the conversation had shifted again, the way it did with them, from the practical to the personal. He said, "Lydia," she said. "Yes," he said, "I've made a decision about spring." She was very still. The lamp between them threw warm light across the table. He said, "I'm going to stay in this territory." She said, "With the aldermans." He said, "I've been thinking about that too." She said, "And?" He said, "I think what I'd rather do, if the person in question is agreeable, is look for a piece of land nearby. My own land. I've got savings enough for a down payment on a small parcel, and I know the land agent in Harlow Flats." She said slowly, "That's a significant decision." He said, "Yes, it is." She said, "What made you decide?" He said, "I think you know the answer to that." She looked at him across the lamp. She said, "Say it plainly, Cyrus." He leaned forward slightly and said, "Clara, whatever this is that we've been building these past weeks, I don't want to be 5 miles north of it and wondering about spring anymore. I want to stop moving. I want to be here." The lamp flickered once between them. Outside, the February wind moved through the pines. She said, "I have been a widow for 18 months. I have a child and a ranch with more demands than income and a temperament that most people find exhausting." He said, "I find it the least exhausting thing in my life." She said, "I am not a woman who is going to be managed." He said, "I am not a man who would try." She said, "I know." He said, "Lydia." She said, "Yes." He said, "May I come courting, properly, with your full knowledge and consent?" She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the blizzard and the voice in the white air saying, "I figured you would come." She thought about the east fence and the Sunday afternoons, and the way he had asked Clara exactly the right question about number 7. She thought about the way he said her name like it was something worth saying with care. She said, "Yes, Cyrus, you may." He exhaled, which she had not expected because she had believed him to be a man not much given to betraying tension, and the realization that she had the capacity to create it in him moved something in her, something that had been still for a very long time. He said, "I'll speak to the land agent on Monday." She said, "The parcel east of the Tolliver Creek is good land." He said, "I was thinking the same one." She said, "Of course you were." And there it was again, that nearly smile that had been in the neighborhood of actual smiling since the first evening, and that she had by now catalogued as one of her favorite things about the face of Cyrus Covington, which was itself a thing she had catalogued as one of her favorite things to look at, which was information she was not yet willing to say out loud but was perfectly capable of knowing. He was the last to look away. He left that night with a quality of deliberateness in his farewell that was different from the previous ones, more certain, more declared, carrying the weight of what had just been agreed upon. She stood in the doorway and watched him ride down her road, and this time she did not look away before he turned at the bend, and she saw him look back before he turned, and she understood that they were now both people who turned to look. March came in hard and went out softer. Cyrus Covington signed a purchase agreement on 42 acres adjacent to the Tolliver Creek parcel, east of her property by 2 miles, in the first week of March, and the land agent in Harlow Flats, who was a man named Phelps with an excellent memory for names, mentioned to at least 3 people that day that Covington had stood in his office and looked at the survey map of the territory with the focused intensity of a man who had been wandering for a long time and had finally picked up a pencil and drawn himself an X. News of this reached Lydia through 3 separate channels within 48 hours, which she considered perfectly illustrative of the information economy of a small Wyoming town. She said nothing publicly, but she went to bed that night with something warm sitting in the center of her chest, and she let herself keep it there. The spring calving began in earnest in the second week of March, and for 2 weeks she and Cyrus worked side by side through the long cold days and the longer cold nights, because calving in Wyoming in March is not a civilized process and does not happen on a schedule that accommodates normal sleep. They took turns at the night watches, and there were 2 cows that needed help that she would not have managed without an extra pair of hands. And there was a night when a calf was born in the 3rd hour past midnight in a driving sleet storm with the temperature at 19 degrees. And when the calf stood up and found its legs, and the mother turned and began cleaning it with that fierce instinctive tenderness, Lydia looked across the lantern at Cyrus and he was looking at her, and neither of them said anything. Because some things are complete without words, they lost 1 calf, a late-term heifer that had been struggling since the previous November. Lydia had known it was likely and she had prepared herself for it, but preparation and reality are never quite the same thing, and she was quiet for the rest of that morning. He did not try to talk her out of it or rush her through it. He was simply there, present and not crowding her, which was exactly right. She said, eventually, "Thank you for being here for this." He said, "There's nowhere I'd rather be." She believed that too. On the first Sunday in April, the ground was beginning to soften, and the snow was in retreat to the north-facing slopes, and the creek was running loud and brown with snowmelt. Clara had spent the morning in the yard performing an elaborate outdoor project involving sticks and string that she described as a map of her cattle territory, and Lydia and Cyrus had been sitting on the porch watching her with the particular peaceful attention of 2 people who are very comfortable with each other. He said, "Lydia," she said, "I know that particular tone of voice." He said, "Do you?" She said, "You use it when you are about to say something you have been thinking about for a while." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I want to ask you to marry me." She turned to look at him. He said, "I am not going to make a speech about it. You know me well enough by now to know that I mean what I say, and what I mean is that I want to build something with you. On this land, or on mine, or on some combination of both that makes sense for the cattle and for Clara and for us. I want to be here, with you, every day." Clara had stopped her cartography project, Lydia noticed, and was watching them from the yard with an expression of barely suppressed anticipation that suggested she had either been listening to more adult conversation than was ideal or had simply been paying close enough attention to understand the trajectory they had been on. Lydia said, "Clara, go check on number 7. Clara said, "She's fine." Lydia said, "Clara." Clara sighed with theatrical depth and moved toward the barn, but not before throwing one significant look back over her shoulder that carried the full weight of her 7-year-old conviction that this was going very well. Lydia turned back to Cyrus. He was watching her with those dark, attentive eyes, without performance, without armor, with the particular vulnerability of a man who has said the most important thing he has ever said, and is now waiting with the full knowledge that he cannot manage what comes next. She said, "You are the most unexpected thing that has happened to me." He said, "Is that yes?" She said, "It's yes." He reached across and took her hand, which was the first time he had done so in the weeks of courtship that had been conducted with a restraint that she had appreciated without ever requesting, and she felt the warmth of it go through her like the first good fire at the end of a hard winter. He said, "Good," she said. "That is your response. Good," he said. "I had a longer speech prepared and then you said yes and I forgot all of it." She laughed. It was a real laugh, fully made, and it startled her a little with its own completeness. The way things you have been not doing for a long time can startle you when they come back. He was still holding her hand. From inside the barn they heard Clara's voice saying, "She's fine, she is very fine. Can I come back now?" Lydia called back, "Yes, Clara, you can come back." Clara came out of the barn at a run, stopped when she saw their joined hands and gave a slow, satisfied nod of absolute certainty. She said, "I knew it." Then she went back to her stick and string cartography project as though nothing had happened, though she was smiling at the ground. They were married in June. The wedding was held at the Methodist Church in Harlow Flats, which was a small white building that nevertheless had 6 rows of pews, and a minister named Reverend Haas, who had officiated at approximately 40 Wyoming weddings, and who had developed a ceremony that was warm, brief, and entirely cognizant of the fact that people in this territory had better things to do than stand in formal clothes for longer than necessary. The town turned out in substantial numbers, because it was the kind of event that Harlow Flats approved of: a widow who had refused to quit, and a steady, capable man who had decided to stop moving, both of them choosing something good. Ed Alderman came and told everyone who would listen that he had tried to keep Covington on for the summer and couldn't quite manage it, but that under the circumstances he supposed he was glad he hadn't. Mrs. Henderson cried in a way that suggested she had been invested in this outcome for some time. Clara stood beside her mother in a white dress that Lydia had made herself from fabric she had been saving since Christmas without entirely admitting why, and held a small bunch of wildflowers. And when Reverend Haas asked if anyone present had any objection to the marriage, Clara said, "Absolutely not," which was not the traditional liturgical response, but which Reverend Haas accepted with good grace, and which drew laughter from the pews that Lydia felt in her chest like warmth. She and Cyrus said their words to each other in the plain, clear daylight coming through the church's south window, and when he looked at her at the moment of the vow, there was the same quality in his expression that had been there since the blizzard, that quality of complete and unhurried attention, as though she was the most interesting and important thing in his field of vision, and he saw no particular reason to pretend otherwise. She said her words back to him and meant every single one of them. After the ceremony, the town of Harlow Flats held a proper celebration in the yard of the Hendersons' place, which was large enough for the purpose, with tables brought from various homes and enough food to suggest that roughly half the women in the community had been baking since Thursday. There was a fiddle player named McCready who could not quite be called gifted, but who played with enough enthusiasm to make the point. And people danced in the warm June evening until the stars came out, and the children fell asleep on folded quilts in the corners of the yard. Cyrus danced with Lydia in the June dark, which was not something she had expected from a man of his contained quality, but which he did with a straightforward competence that made her think the Missouri of his childhood had included dancing, and she said so. He said, "My mother was insistent." She said, "I like your mother." He said, "You've never met her." She said, "I still like her." He pulled her slightly closer and said quietly against her hair, "She's going to like you considerably more than she liked the one before." She said, "You wrote to her." He said, "I wrote to her in March." She said, "March, Cyrus." He said, "I was fairly certain by March." She said, "You were fairly certain the evening you told me you figured I would come." He said against her hair, "I was not going to admit that at the time." She said, "You don't have to admit anything. I know you." He said, "Yes, you do." They danced until McCready's arm gave out, and then they sat with Clara asleep between them on a bench at the edge of the yard, and Lydia leaned her head against Cyrus's shoulder and looked at the Wyoming stars and thought that the world was, at this particular moment, as ordered as it was ever going to be. The summer that followed was the best working summer Lydia had known since before Thomas died. This was not because everything was easy. Nothing about ranching in Wyoming in 1878 was easy, and the summer brought its own particular difficulties. A drought stretch in July that required creative management of the creek water, a dispute with a neighboring rancher named Graves over the trail access road that ran through the southern end of her property, and that Cyrus handled with a directness and calm that got the matter resolved in 2 conversations where it had been festering for 2 years. And a week in August when 3 of the cattle developed a respiratory illness that required around-the-clock attention and ultimately cost her 2 animals. But it was good because she was not alone in any of it. That was the essential difference, and it was not something she had let herself admit wanting, because wanting something you do not have is the most efficient way to make its absence unbearable. But now that she had it, now that Cyrus was there at the beginning of every day and at the end of every day, and through the middle of all the days in between. She understood what the aloneness had cost her in ways she had not fully calculated. He moved his things from the alderman spread the morning after the wedding, and the 42 acres by Tolliver Creek became, in the practical mathematics of their life, a piece of land they were building together. His savings went into fencing it properly and into a small but well-built cabin that he raised with help from a man named Ordega who had worked construction in the territory for 15 years, and which they used as a secondary structure for the combined operation of their 2 adjoining properties, which Lydia began to think of as one ranch by other means. Clara adapted to having Cyrus in the house with the particular ease of a child who has already decided to like a person and has simply been waiting for the formal arrangements to catch up. She called him Cyrus for the first several months, and then one morning in September she called him Pa without particularly announcing that she was going to, and Cyrus had been very still for a moment at the breakfast table before saying, "Good morning, Clara," in a voice that was slightly rougher than usual, and then getting on with his coffee, and Lydia had looked down at her plate and given everyone a moment to recover. The fall of 1878 was beautiful. Lydia would remember it always as the season that had the quality of good things newly arrived and not yet taken for granted, when every ordinary morning, the light coming up gold across the snow-dusted northern ridge, the cattle moving in their familiar slow way across the frozen creek, the smell of coffee and the sound of boots on the kitchen floor, had a depth of pleasure that felt like something she had earned. She found out she was pregnant in October. She told Cyrus on a Sunday morning when Clara was at the Hendersons, because she wanted to tell him first, and privately, because some things are made for 2 people before they are made for any others. He was at the kitchen table with the ranch accounts when she came in and sat across from him, and she said, "Cyrus, I have something to tell you." He looked up from the accounts with the full attention he always brought to her voice. She said, "We're going to have a baby, in the spring, I think, April or May." He was very still. She said, "Cyrus." He said in a voice very different from his usual voice, "Are you certain?" She said, "I am." He got up from the table and came around to her side of it, and he took both her hands in his, and he looked at her with an expression she had no word for. It was too large for happiness alone. It had something of the quality of a man who has not believed in something for a long time and is confronting its actual existence, undefended. He said, "Lydia." She said, "Yes." He said, "Thank you." She said, "You were quite involved in the project." He laughed, which cracked the intensity of the moment without dissolving it, and she laughed too, and then he pulled her to him and held her with a careful and certain tenderness, and she let herself be held, which was still a thing she was learning to do and which she was getting better at. The news reached Harlow Flats with the speed that had become predictable to both of them. Mrs. Henderson appeared at the ranch within 3 days with a pound cake and a knowing expression that suggested she had expected this development and was gratified to have it confirmed. Clara was told the following Sunday and received the information with a solemnity that rapidly gave way to extremely specific opinions about names, several of which were the names of her cattle. Lydia said firmly, "We are not naming a child after a cow." Clara said, "But 7 is a beautiful name." Cyrus said, "What about a human name that also happens to be good? What about James?" Clara considered. She said, "James is fine, but I want to be the one who decides what his nickname is." Cyrus said, "That seems reasonable." Lydia said, "Clara, we do not know that it's a boy." Clara said, "It is." Lydia said, "You cannot know that." Clara said, "I know things." Cyrus caught Lydia's eye over Clara's head, and the expression he gave her was the kind that belongs only to 2 people who share a child and a particular knowledge of that child's personality, and Lydia felt the warmth of it all the way down. The winter of 1878 going into 1879 was milder than the previous one, which Lydia was grateful for in the straightforward physical way of a woman who was increasingly uncomfortable in the later months of a pregnancy, and who had no interest in walking into another blizzard after cattle. The cattle, however, were behaving themselves. The fence was in the best repair it had been since before Thomas's accident. The barn had been reinforced against the cold in October. The root cellar was full. Cyrus managed the heavy outdoor work through the worst of December and January with the help of a young man named Riley, who was 16 and had been working odd jobs around Harlow Flats, and who had the quality of a boy who simply needed someone to show him how to do things correctly and then trust him to do them. Cyrus showed him and trusted him, and Riley repaid this with the fierce and specific loyalty that young people can develop for the adults who treat them as capable. And by February, he was doing the fence checks alone and reporting back with accuracy. Lydia spent the winter months doing the accounts and writing, and doing the 100 organizational tasks that a ranch requires that do not involve being out in the cold. And she sat by the window in the afternoons with the light on the snow and felt the baby moving and thought about the circularity of things, the way life accumulates loss, and then, if you are patient and present enough, begins to accumulate something else. She thought about Thomas sometimes. She thought about him without the previous mixture of grief and anger, which had softened into something more like clear sadness, the clean kind, the kind that acknowledges someone was real and mattered and is now gone without the complicated freight of blame. She thought he would have liked Cyrus, and she thought he would have been grateful, in whatever way the dead can be grateful, for what she had built on the land they had built together. She told Cyrus this one evening, said it plainly the way she said most things, and he was quiet for a while and then said, "I think about him too sometimes, not in a complicated way, just as a fact about you, about who you are. The things you learned because of him and the things you learned despite him and the things you built without him." He paused. "He's part of this. I'm not afraid of that," she said. "Most men would be." He said, "I'm not most men." She said, "No, you are really not." The baby came on the 9th of May, 1879, which was a warm and windy morning with the cottonwoods by the creek already fully leafed out, and the cattle in the east pasture looking sleek and well, because the winter had been gentle and the spring grass had come in early and rich. The labor was long and hard enough that Lydia, who had done this once before and had thought she remembered what to expect, was reminded that the body does not reliably remember pain, which is either a mercy or a trick depending on your perspective. Mrs. Henderson was there as midwife, as she had been for half the births in Harlow Flats, and Cyrus was sent to the yard with the instruction that he was to stay there, which he did, and which Lydia knew because every time consciousness and pain allowed her to be aware of things outside the immediate struggle, she could hear him moving in the yard with the particular pacing energy of a man who is very good at being useful and is currently unable to be useful at all. The baby was born at 4 in the afternoon. He was a boy, as Clara had predicted with her inexplicable certainty, and he was strong and loud about his arrival, and when Mrs. Henderson put him in Lydia's arms and she held him for the first time, she felt all the way through her bones the same thing she had felt when she held Clara for the first time, that particular specific love that is not like any other, that love that is entirely its own kind, immediate and absolute, and not requiring any particular cause. Mrs. Henderson called Cyrus in. He came into the room with the particular careful quality of a large, strong man moving through a space where fragile things matter, and he stopped when he saw them, Lydia in the bed with the baby, and his face did the thing it had done in October when she told him the news, that thing for which she still did not have a single sufficient word. He came to the bedside and looked down at his son and said, very quietly, "Well, hello." The baby stared at him with the unfocused but earnest attention of the newborn, as though attempting to catalog a face that would become the most important face he had ever known. Lydia said, "James," Cyrus said, "James." He said it like a confirmation. He reached out and carefully, with the same deliberate tenderness he gave to all things he valued, touched the baby's hand, and the baby's fingers closed around one of his, and Cyrus made a sound that was very quiet and not intended to be heard, but that Lydia heard. Clara appeared in the doorway, having been at the Hendersons all day at the direct instruction of her mother, and came to the foot of the bed and looked at her brother with the expression of someone who has had an expectation confirmed. She said, "James Thomas Covington." Lydia looked at her. Clara said, "That's what we should name him. James for the name we picked and Thomas for because." Lydia looked at Cyrus. He looked at her. He said softly, "I think that's a fine name." She said, "James Thomas Covington." Clara said, "I knew it would work out." Mrs. Henderson, who had been tidying up with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had attended many such moments, paused and looked around the room at Lydia in the bed, at Cyrus holding his son's fingers, at Clara standing at the foot with her characteristic certainty, and said, "I will tell you all something. In 20 years of attending births in this territory, I have never once attended one quite so much like it was supposed to happen." Nobody argued with her. The summer of 1879 was, in the particular accounting that Lydia kept in the honest ledger of her experience, the fullest summer she had ever lived. Full in the way that means containing the complete range of things, the hard work and the heat, and the inevitable smaller difficulties that land and animals and weather produce, and also the beauty of it, the specific beauty of a life that is genuinely being lived and not simply endured. James was a solid and contented baby who slept with determination and woke with appetite, and regarded the world with a seriousness that reminded Lydia of his father in a way she found deeply amusing. Clara took her older sibling responsibilities with enormous seriousness, explaining to him daily, from her position beside his basket, the personalities of the 14 cattle, several of which had been replaced but whose individual character assessments had been transferred to the new animals in the composition book. Whether James received or benefited from this education was unclear, but he looked at her while she talked, and Clara considered that sufficient. Riley stayed on through the summer as a full hand, having decided somewhere in the spring that he would rather learn ranching than move on to the mines in the north as he had vaguely planned, and Cyrus taught him with the same patient method he brought to everything, and by August Riley was handling the south pasture rotation on his own judgment and making good decisions about it. In September, a letter came from Cyrus's mother in Missouri, a long letter in a careful hand that had clearly taken several sittings to complete, addressed to both of them, to Lydia and Cyrus Covington, and which Lydia read at the kitchen table while Cyrus watched her from across the room with the expression of a man who knows his mother well enough to be slightly apprehensive. The letter was, in fact, warm and specific, and full of the particular intelligence of a woman who had known Cyrus all his life, and who wrote about her son with clarity, acknowledging his best qualities and his particular difficulties, the way he carried things, the way he needed somewhere to stop moving, and who said directly that she was grateful beyond her ability to say so that he had found it. Lydia read it twice and then looked at Cyrus and said, "Your mother is remarkable." He said, "She would like you very much." She said, "I intend to write her back." He said, "I was hoping you would." She did. She wrote 3 pages that evening after dinner, with James asleep in his basket and Clara reading by the lamp and Cyrus doing the accounts. And she told Cyrus's mother about the ranch and about Clara and about James and about the storm and the cattle and the broken fence and the moment in the blizzard when she had heard a voice saying something she had not expected. And she said, "Your son has the quality, very rare in my experience, of understanding a situation before he has been told about it." I believe he had worked out something about me from the available evidence before we had ever spoken, and I find I cannot entirely object to being known by someone without having needed to perform the explanation. She sealed the letter and set it on the stack for the next mail rider. Cyrus looked at it and said, "You didn't tell me what you wrote." She said, "No," he said. "Should I be worried?" She said, "You should not." He said, "She's going to love you." She said, "Good." The following spring, in April of 1880, Cyrus's mother, whose name was Margaret, came west on the Union Pacific to Cheyenne, and then north by stage to Harlow Flats for a visit that was planned for 2 weeks and lasted 6. She was 61 years old and had the look of a woman who had also spent her life doing hard things without making a particular production of it. And she and Lydia recognized each other in the way that women of a certain quality sometimes do, immediately and without the need for much preliminary negotiation. She sat in Lydia's kitchen and held James, who was almost a year old and had developed the confident assumption of a baby who expects to be held and has rarely been disappointed. And she looked around the kitchen and at the land visible through the window, and she said, "He wrote me in March of last year and said he had found the place he wanted to stop." Lydia said, "He told me he wrote in March." Margaret said, "He said it was the people, but I think he meant specifically one person." Lydia said, "He told me." Margaret looked at her. She said, "I know. He's never said things he didn't mean, even when it caused him trouble. That's a quality I gave him, and I've never known whether to be proud of it or apologize for it." Lydia said, "Be proud of it. It's the thing that made this possible." Margaret nodded and looked down at James, who was investigating the buttons on her coat with the focused scientific intensity of the 10-month-old. She said quietly, "His father would have liked this. He would have liked all of this." Lydia said, "Tell me about him." And Margaret did. She talked about Cyrus's father, who had died when Cyrus was 20, and who had been a farmer in the Missouri tradition, hardworking and quietly devoted, a man who showed love primarily through the quality of his attention to the people he loved. She talked about the farm and the early years and the ways that Missouri had shaped her son, and the ways he had grown beyond and around that shaping. And Lydia listened, and added these things to the things she knew about Cyrus, and felt the picture of him grow fuller and more three-dimensional, which she had not thought was possible because she had already thought she knew him rather well. That evening after supper, with Margaret and Clara in the sitting room doing something involving the composition book and Margaret's genuine interest in cattle personalities, Lydia and Cyrus stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the yard in the April evening light, which was the warm horizontal gold of late afternoon, and she said, "She is everything you told me she was." He said, "She is considerably easier with you than she is with most people." She said, "We recognize each other." He said, "I know, I noticed." She said, "You notice everything." He said, "Not everything, just the things that matter." She turned to look at him. 2 years from the blizzard, 18 months from their wedding, one child grown and one child growing, a ranch that was producing better than it had in 3 years, a life that had been built from necessity and grief and stubbornness, and had arrived through some improbable series of events that included a broken fence and 14 stray cattle and a snowstorm at this precise evening, this light, this man. She said, "Cyrus." He said, "Yes." She said, "That day in the storm. When you said you figured I would come." He said, "Yes." She said, "What would you have done if I hadn't come, I mean?" He thought about it. He said, "I would have taken the cattle to your barn and left a note." She said, he said, "And I would have found a reason to come by the following day." She said, "To check on the cattle." He said, "To check on the cattle," she said, "and if I had been entirely disagreeable and uninterested," he said, "then I would have gone back to the alderman's and spent a considerable amount of time trying to convince myself I was fine with that." She said, "And would you have been?" He said, "No." She said, "Good." He reached out and found her hand in the doorway light, the same hand he had taken across the table in February of the year before, and she let him have it, as she had been letting him have it since, which was a thing she had not found easy at first, and had found increasingly and then completely natural, the way you find your footing on unfamiliar ground and eventually stop thinking about it because the ground has become your own. From the sitting room came the sound of Clara's voice explaining the hierarchy of cattle personalities to a grandmother who was receiving this information with apparent sincerity. And from the basket by the stove, the small sound of James beginning to register that supper was past due, and he had opinions about this. Lydia pressed Cyrus's hand once and then went to her son. The years that came after were years of ordinary and extraordinary in the proportion that makes a life feel real: hard winters and good summers, cattle lost and cattle born, fences that broke and were repaired, disputes and resolutions, the growth of Clara from 7 to 11 to 15, learning to ride as well as anyone in the territory, and taking over the composition book with additions that now ran to 3 volumes. And James growing from a serious baby into a serious boy who had his father's quality of attention and his mother's quality of directness, and who took to ranch work with an earnestness that made the old-timers in Harlow Flats nod and say things about chips and old blocks. Margaret came back the following year and the year after that, and eventually, when she was 65 and Missouri had become harder to manage alone, she came and did not go back, and the spare room at the end of the hall became hers, and she and Clara and Lydia formed a domestic confederacy of 3 women that Cyrus navigated with a combination of good sense and appropriate humility, and which served the ranch very well. In the spring of 1882, Lydia found herself pregnant again. She told Cyrus on a Sunday morning with the particular plainness she had established as her method for delivering significant news, and he received it with the same quality of feeling he had brought to all the significant things, that fullness that could not quite contain itself in his face. This time it was a girl. They named her Ruth. Clara, who was 11 by then, received this news with the expression of someone who had not predicted this particular outcome, but was willing to accept it gracefully. She said, "Ruth is a good name." Then she said, "I have opinions about the upbringing." Cyrus said, "I'm certain you do." Clara said, "She should know the cattle names from the start." "Not later from the start." Lydia said, Clara said, "It's a matter of her education." Ruth arrived in September of 1882, loud and decided about it, red-faced and clear in her announcement that she was here and intended to be considered. She grew into a child who was exactly what you might expect from the daughter of 2 such people: specific, attentive, opinionated in the particular way of people who are also usually right. And the household of the Covington Ranch absorbed her with the completeness of a family that had room in it because it had been built carefully and on a firm foundation. There came a morning in the fall of 1883 when Lydia was standing at the kitchen window watching Cyrus and James, who was 4 by then, walk out to the barn together, the man and the small boy moving in the early light with James wearing a hat that was too large for him but that he had insisted on as a matter of principle. And she thought about the blizzard again, which she did sometimes, not with grief or nostalgia, but with a kind of grateful awe for the particular precision of chance. She had walked out into the white fury of it because there was no one else to go, because that was simply what a person did, and he had been there already, and he had said, "I figured you would come," and the whole enormous architecture of everything that followed had its foundation in those words, in the moment of being known before you have been met, in the recognition that is not magic but is also not entirely explicable. She thought about broken fences and storms and the particular mathematics of loss and possibility, and she thought about how the calculus of her life had shifted from subtraction to something else. Riley came by that afternoon to check in on the South Pasture report, and he brought his new wife, a woman from Cheyenne named Delia who had a quick laugh and strong opinions about livestock management, and whom Clara had immediately and unreservedly approved of. And they sat in the kitchen and drank coffee and argued good-naturedly about the best method for managing the spring pasture rotation. And outside James could be heard attempting to teach Ruth, who was 14 months old and not yet walking steadily, the proper way to approach a fence, which was not information she currently needed but which he was committed to providing. Margaret came in from the yard where she had been doing what she called her constitutional, which was a 10-minute walk that she took every afternoon to look at the land and report back on its condition, and she sat down at the table and said, "The north fence is good. The creek is running clean. The sky looks like good weather through Thursday." Lydia said, "Thank you, Margaret." Margaret said, "Also James has taught the baby to say fence." Cyrus said, "That's his father's vocabulary starting early." Everyone laughed, including Lydia, and the sound of it went through the kitchen, and out into the warm fall afternoon, where it dispersed into the broad Wyoming air, over the good fence and the clean creek and the north pasture with its content cattle, over the grave of the first husband who had been loved and was mourned with clarity, over the land that had been kept through stubbornness and necessity, over the east corner that had been repaired in a February cold, over the northern ridge where the cattle drifted in storms, over the road with its bend where two people had begun the habit of turning to look. This was what she had built. Not instead of what she had lost, but out of what she had kept the land and the cattle and herself and the willingness, one winter evening, to say yes to a man who had already been in the storm before her and had known she was coming. It was enough. It was, in fact, considerably more than enough. It was the whole thing.